Hey, happy Friday everyone. It's been a busy past couple of days in Europe. This week, Europe's defense companies anticipate European rearmament, Germans are preparing to go to the polls, Europe tries to launch itself into the AI race, and Muslims have controversial opinions. Welcome to Last Week in Europe. So European defense stocks surged last week following calls from the United States for higher spending ahead of talks on a possible Ukraine peace deal. But now that Europe is spending more on defense, can Europe's defense industry actually produce the guns, tanks, and bombs it needs? Well, Europe's biggest challenge is increasing local production. We saw this last year when the EU failed to deliver on a promise to give Ukraine 1 million artillery shells. The first reason for that is that European countries have chronically underfunded their defense industry. As we can see in this graph, EU countries increased their defense spending by 30% between 2021 and 2024, reaching about 326 billion euros last year. But most of that money actually hasn't served to build guns at home. According to one French think tank, between February 2022 and June 2023, European countries purchased 78% of their defense equipment outside of the EU, with 63% of orders going to the US. This leaves Europe's defense industry significantly undersized. And the second challenge is fragmentation. Unlike the US or China, which have giant defense firms which benefit from huge contracts, Europe's industry is fragmented between different countries. France has Thales, Italy has Leonardo, Germany has Rheinmetall, and so Europe has over 2,500 small and medium-sized defense enterprises. This also leads to inefficiencies and countries making similar products. European defense companies produce 26 different types of battleships, 20 different types of fighter planes, 15 types of tanks, whereas the US only has one main battle tank. Most importantly, fragmentation makes it hard to scale production. But differently, small players operate in small markets and produce small volumes. As we can see in this table, in 2024, the US's biggest contractor, Lockheed Martin, had a bigger arms revenue than the EU's 9 biggest defense companies combined. The third challenge is that Europe invests little in weapons development, and while investments increased massively since 2020 to reach 102 billion euros last year, this needs some time to pay off. Finally, European defense companies are dependent on foreign microchips and critical raw materials, so supply chain bottlenecks can limit production. And while defense is mainly a national responsibility, the EU is taking steps to improve coordination, increase production capacity, and reduce external dependencies. In fact, the European Commission has presented proposals and legislation to make the EU countries spend more together. In 2021, only 18% of the weapons bought by the EU countries were bought by 2 or more countries combined. And the Commission wants to increase this to 40% by 2030 to strengthen the industry. It also revealed an 8 billion euro fund to finance research and development. European Commission President von der Leyen also said that she wants to relax the budget rules for countries to make it easier to increase their defense spending. And in March, the Commission will present a white paper on defense, including plans for large investment and more cooperation. But the largest challenge is European countries rallying around their national champions, which makes joint projects and purchases a nightmare. The European Union is racing to keep up in the global competition on artificial intelligence. At an AI summit in Paris, European leaders pledged to stop regulating and help with innovating to stay in the race, fearing dependence on China and the US. So where does Europe's AI industry actually stand? A lot of the attention these past couple of months has been on large language models, which are able to understand and generate human language. And they're seen as the building block to many commercial applications since they can actually write code, do math, but also interact with customers. For the most advanced AI models, China and especially the US are in the lead. That's because tech giants like Microsoft-backed OpenAI, Google's DeepMind, Baidu, and Alibaba have spent billions. In this graph, we can see that in 2023, 109 foundation models that perform a wide range of tasks were released in the US, against 15 in the EU and UK. But by 2025, the herd has thinned significantly. Germany's Aleph Alpha stopped developing the technology altogether, saying it was too costly to develop, leaving France's Mistral as the only European company in the top rankings. And while these companies and research labs are building large language models, it's no guarantee for commercial success later on. The AI race is also about developing products around this new technology. These companies, for example, cater to specific businesses directly through more specialized models and application. Here again, the US is in the lead. Over half of all AI startups between 2013 and 2023 were founded in the US. Blink, a research center, puts 9 EU countries in the top 20 of AI superpowers, with Estonia ranking at number 6. But for European companies, scaling remains a challenge. The fragmented European market and lower access to venture capital makes it harder for startups to grow into global leaders. And that's exactly Europe's biggest challenge, funding, which is a problem for all European companies. The US private sector put over 60 billion in 2023, compared to less than 10 billion in the European Union. But even funding is no guarantee of success. Small, nimble Chinese labs like DeepSeek have managed to make groundbreaking models, which are both performing well and much cheaper to run than those of some more established players like OpenAI. Investment for AI companies is one thing, but the AI industry is also hungry for electricity and computing power. In response, the EU, governments, and companies are taking out their checkbooks, and the EU announced a 20 billion euro package to build data centers. France, arguably the EU's most enthusiastic AI player, has pledged 109 billion euros, and 60 major European firms committed an additional 150 billion euros across the continent. This money will be used to scale up European AI startups, develop AI models for industrial applications, and AI infrastructure, such as data centers. And that's because AI companies don't only need money, they need data processing power. Europe is home to around 1,200 data centers, but even that isn't enough, and the EU still needs more computing power. Last year, Europe saw investments into data centers increase by 168%, and CBRE expects a 43% increase in data center capacity in 2025. But Europe faces an important challenge to building the data centers it needs. EU energy prices are currently 2 to 3 times higher than in China and the US, which risks putting a dent in its ability to roll out the data centers it needs. And finally, we have to talk about regulation. Last year, the EU signed off on the AI Act to manage the risks of this new technology. But the EU regulation hasn't been without critics. Just last year, 50 companies signed this open letter arguing that EU regulation meant losing the AI race. In fact, the EU's privacy regulation, in the form of a GDPR, has been used to sue Mistral AI for using user data to improve its models. But the EU says it's now shifting its stance from regulation to cash and innovation. On the day of the AI summit, the EU backtracked on a law set to make tech companies pay for harm caused by AI tools. The Commission also introduced more pro-innovation policies, which included the right for innovative startups to face less scrutiny and making the EU supercomputers available for startups. So the EU is working hard to stay in the global AI competition, and Europe has some things going for it, a growing startup scene and recently a lot of investment. But it still faces significant funding, scaling, and infrastructure challenges, and retaining talents to truly compete with the US and China. Germany is heading to the polls next Sunday. Back in November, the three-party coalition led by the Social Democrats collapsed, leading to early elections. With the Christian Democrat CDU-CSU leading the polls with a big lead over the far-right AfD, their lead candidate Friedrich Merz is projected to become the next German chancellor, leading a coalition with 1 or 2 junior partners. This coalition will likely exclude the AfD, since all of Germany's other parties have stated that they don't want to cooperate with them. But how could Friedrich Merz as a chancellor change Germany's position in Europe, and what could this mean for the rest of the EU? Germany has long been the strongest advocate for financial discipline in the EU, but Germany recently supported common debt programs like the 750 billion euro post-COVID recovery fund. Merz, however, dismissed common borrowing as a debt spiral and wants European governments to return to strict budget rules, although he's named defense as a possible exception. This would make it harder for countries like Spain, Italy, and France to push for more financial solidarity. Now that leaders throughout the EU are calling for common debt, a bigger EU budget, and a relaxation of budget rules to increase spending in areas like defense and innovation. Merz wants to prioritize economic competitiveness and reduce EU bureaucracy, calling for a bureaucracy break and a temporary halt on new EU law proposals. If he becomes chancellor, expect Germany to push for a more business-friendly EU, focusing on reducing barriers for the EU single market and pushing back against industry regulation. In the past, Merz has specifically criticized parts of the EU's Green Deal for hurting industry. A CDU-led Germany might water down or reverse some environmental policies, especially those affecting its automobile and heavy industry. But the key issue to this election is immigration, with 37% of citizens calling it the most important problem in a recent survey. Merz believes that Germany's asylum policies are too lenient and has promised to introduce permanent border controls with all neighboring countries. Within the EU, Germany could call for stronger EU border controls, more strict asylum rules, and more support for Frontex, the EU's border agency. In its election program, the CDU says it wants to transfer asylum seekers to migrant centers outside the EU, an idea that's gaining ground across the bloc. Merz has also criticized Olaf Scholz for a lack of leadership on the international stage and wants Germany to lead the EU, also in dealing with Donald Trump. Unlike Scholz, who has been cautious about sending heavy weapons such as long-range missiles to Ukraine, Merz has pushed for more military support. He's argued that European defense should be built within NATO, though, rather than through independent EU initiatives. This could put Germany at odds with countries like France that are pushing for the EU to be more independent on defense. In summary, with Friedrich Merz as chancellor, the rest of the EU will likely have to deal with a Germany that is more conservative on money, more business-oriented, strict on migration, and more willing to lead on the international stage. The 2 biggest question marks are what coalition emerges from the election and how Germany will deal with domestic problems like immigration and its floundering economy. Opinion polls in Europe are shedding light on the large cultural gap between Muslims and the rest of society, and considering that Muslims are a growing share of Europe's population and voters, this will have some pretty important implications for the future. First, Muslims are much more likely to have creationist beliefs. 71% of French Muslims reported that they didn't believe humans were descended from evolution, versus 27% of the general population. Similarly, 76% responded that if religion and science were in conflict, they would trust their religion, versus 18% for the general public. The United Kingdom showed similar results, where 44.2% of Muslims rejected, and a further 29% were unsure of the idea that humans evolved from simpler non-human life forms over time. This is far lower than the general public, but ahead of some Christian denominations like Pentecostals and Evangelicals. These differences extend to the legal sphere, where Muslims are much more likely to believe in religious law. In the UK, 32% of Muslims saw Sharia, Islamic law, as being desirable or somewhat desirable, while in France, 38% of Muslims agreed with the statement that Sharia is above the laws of the Republic. It's even higher for young Muslims. In those aged between 15 and 24, that number rose to 57%. In a separate opinion poll in Germany, 68% of young Muslims saw Islamic law as more important than the German constitution. Some went even further, with about 36.5% wanting an Islamic state following those Islamic laws. And a significant minority of Muslims in Europe are ready to justify the use of violence. In the Netherlands, 8% of Muslims thought that violence was justified and understand that people would use violence for their religion. In France, 16% of Muslims refused to condemn or fully condemn the assassination of Dominique Bernard, a high school teacher that showed cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad. And for those still in school, that number was 31%, which is in line with Germany, where 35% of young Muslims understood violence against those who insulted Allah or Muhammad. And 18% judged that violence was justified when it came to promoting the interest of Islam. These are opinions that already affect European elections, with Muslim voters forming a sizable voting bloc and even looking to set up their political parties. How European countries can deal with this gap is something I explored in a long-form video on the European politics of Islam.